Hey guys, and welcome to our very first remote learning lecture. So, if you don't know what a lecture is, that's that time in the classroom where you're sitting taking notes while I talk about the slides that are on the smartboard. So, obviously, we're not in class right now. And so, this is what we're going to do. I'm going to record a video of me going over the slides as you see on the screen. And while I do this, you guys will do what you always do, which is fill in your notes. So if you're watching this video and you haven't opened up the notes that I attached on the Google Classroom assignment, you need to do that first, okay? So there's going to be an assignment that says student notes, and you're going to open it up, and it's basically my slides, right? It should look exactly like this, but with no notes in them, right? You don't have to copy this first slide. You can start when we get here, but this is just my introduction, right? So you guys are going to copy down the notes as I go through it. There shouldn't be any need for you to pause the video because I'm going to be talking while I explain everything that's on the screen, and you just copy down the actual notes. At the end of this lesson, you are responsible for having the notes because just like in regular class, you would have to take a quiz or a test afterwards. All right, so let's get started. Okay, so I figure we're going to begin Unit 4. It is Medieval Asia. And a good way to start is to talk about the religions. So don't worry, at some point we are going to get to talking about Japan and China and the Mongols and all that. But a lot of times it's important to understand the mindset. The people of Asia are very different mentally than the people that we've been discussing thus far with the Europeans and the Middle Eastern Muslim caliphates and the African caliphates, right? Because they have a completely different style of religion. The Europeans and the Africans and the Middle East were basically Abrahamic religions, right? The Christianity, Judaism, Islam, they were very similar religions. We discussed that, right? They all believed in one God, all powerful God, and they all claim to be descendants of Abraham, and they have prophets and all that. And it's important to understand their religion so that we understand the politics and the wars that they fought against one another, especially when we talked about the Crusades, right? In that same way, it's important to understand the religions of Asia because they're very, very different. But especially when we talk about Japan and Eastern China, Buddhism and Hinduism are going to be very important, right? So we are going to talk about those two religions. There's a lot of other religions in Asia, but these two are by far the most popular. There are 1.5 billion people who follow Hinduism or Buddhism today. And in the medieval time period, both of these religions were very much well established. Now, we're going to do things a little bit backwards because Hinduism is way older than Buddhism. Hinduism is actually the oldest religion that is still practiced in the world. It is believed to be about 5,000 years old. But we're going to start with Buddhism, which actually comes afterwards. And I have my reasons for that, but we're going to get started, right? So this is going to be your first slide. And if you're following along your notes, you should notice that you have the bullets and you need to fill this in, right? So what is Buddhism, right? So basically, you guys know it's a religion, and we're going to cover some basics, right? It was founded by a guy named Siddhartha Gautama. This would be the time in class where I would make all you guys repeat it so you could repeat it to yourself. Siddhartha Gautama. And it is believed that he basically became the founder of this new religion around the year 500 BCE. So that's 500 years before Jesus in Rome, right? So that makes it 2,500 years old. So just for comparison's sake, Buddhism is a lot older than Christianity and way older than Islam, right? So it starts with Siddhartha Gautama. And basically, like I mentioned this before, there's 500 million Buddhists in the world today, mainly found in East Asia. So countries like Japan, China, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, those countries. But also Buddhism has some following in the Americas, mainly in the United States. But let's talk about Siddhartha Gautama, also known as the Buddha. So I think all you guys have probably heard of the Buddha, or maybe you've seen that little statue of the guy sitting there. That's a Buddha statue. And it's not always actually a depiction of Siddhartha Gautama, and I'll explain that. So basically, what you need to know about this guy is that he was a Hindu prince. And by Hindu, I mean, yeah, he practiced the religion of Hinduism. So one thing that I want you guys to understand is that Siddhartha Gautama was Hindu, even though he became the founder of a brand new religion, which is Buddhism, which is what we're starting with, right? So that sounds a little confusing, but it's really not, because you're actually familiar with it. It happens a lot sometimes in history, right? We actually have already spoken this year about a guy who became the founder of a brand new religion, even though he was a follower of an older religion, right? There was a guy who founded Christianity, but he was never Christian, right? Those of you who maybe remember, I'm talking about Jesus, right? Jesus was Jewish, and based on his Jewish beliefs, he added things to Judaism, and basically all of his followers after him became known as Christians, right? But Jesus was never Christian, he was always Jewish. In that same way, Siddhartha Gautama was always Hindu, and he believed in a lot of Hindu belief systems, right? And he built on it all these new ideas, and all of his followers afterwards became known as Buddhists because he got the name of Buddha, right? So Jesus and Siddhartha Gautama are very similar in that way. They started with an older religion and created a new religion. So make sure you remember that, because that will definitely be coming up later on. So as you guys copy this down, I'm going to tell you basically the story of Siddhartha. At this point, you should have already watched a video about him, but it's very important for your activity later on, so just bear with me, right? So this is like story time with Mr. Lee right here, right? So Siddhartha was a Hindu prince, and he spent his entire life living inside of the palace, right? So if you don't know, a palace is not the same as a castle, right? A palace can be several buildings. It's like a complex, right? And so it's possible for someone to live their entire life there. The palace is going to have several buildings. It's going to have gardens. It's going to have whatever you need. It's all there. There's an entire community living there. There's the slaves. There's the family, extended family. So Siddhartha actually lived his entire life, all the way up into his 20s, without ever leaving the palace. And this was by design. This is the way his father wanted it. His father wanted Siddhartha to be the next king, and he wanted to raise him and basically shelter him from anything that could corrupt Siddhartha. So imagine that, growing up in a palace your entire life, right? It sounds nice, but is it really? Yeah, everybody treats him like a prince, and he can eat whatever he wants, do whatever he wants. It's a great feeling, right? And most of you guys will probably say, like, I wouldn't mind living in a palace. But is it really nice if you've also never not lived in a palace, right? It's kind of like, do you really appreciate something if you've also never had to go without it? Like, do you appreciate a sunny day if your entire life every day has always been sunny? Do you really appreciate the fact that it's nice and sunny outside? A better example for you guys is, like, do you appreciate school if you've always been stuck going to school, right? Sometimes if it gets taken away from you, that's when you appreciate it, right? Like when it's a rainy day out for a week, you get very excited when it's a nice sunny day, right? The same way, maybe sometimes you guys over the summertime, maybe in late August, you start thinking to yourself, "Wow, man, I wish I was in school." And then you're actually happy to be back in school. But would you appreciate school if you always had to go? Right, especially right now. Look at us. We're remote learning because of the pandemic that's going on. I bet a lot of you guys didn't realize how much you appreciated school. So Siddhartha, you might think he was lucky to live in a palace his whole life, but if that's all he's ever known, he probably didn't really care about being in a palace. And eventually his curiosity did get to him, and he decided to venture outside. He snuck out of the palace one day, and this is basically where his whole journey begins. Now, there's a lot of different ways the story goes, but you're going to learn the way I tell it. So I'm going to tell it to you now. When he finally leaves the palace, Siddhartha encounters four people, right? And as the story goes, the first person he encounters is a sick man. And you're going to need to remember this. This will be on your quiz. So he's walking down the road and he encounters what they call a sick man. But really, what this really was a person with a disease or with a disability. And Siddhartha, living inside this palace his whole life, has never seen someone being sick. He's never been sick before. Sick people were never allowed to be near him. He was always sheltered from that. So when he approaches this man, he asks him, what's wrong? And the man explains to him, well, I have this disease, right? And we don't know what disease the man has, but we can just think of people with disabilities, right? He's never encountered this, right? Think of a disability that you might be familiar with, like, for example, someone who's blind or deaf or in a wheelchair, right? Or people that have suffered from autism or some sort of mental disorder, right? Like, it's a difficult life. And this is the first time Siddhartha encounters someone like this. So it makes him kind of sad to realize, there are people that have to go through life with these major disabilities, right? Like, we've all seen someone maybe missing a limb, from a car accident, or, my experience, I know what it's like to be blind. It's not an easy life. And this really moves Siddhartha. It makes him really sad, like realizing, man, these people suffer. I didn't know that there were people who lived life like this. So that kind of leaves a mark on Siddhartha, and he continues his journey. And as he walks down the road further, he now encounters a second person. This time, what he encounters is a very, very, very old man, right? An elderly person. And believe it or not, Siddhartha has never encountered someone so old before in his life, sheltered in his palace. And when he sees the old man, again, Siddhartha gets very sad, because what you realize, we all know some elderly person in our life, right? Whether it's your grandparents or just someone older. And elderly people, they struggle, right? They're not what they once were, right? They can't move as fast. Their hearing is not as good. Their vision starts to go, all sorts of things. Now, you might know some very healthy elderly people, but they're still not going to be in the same shape that they once were, right? So it's a fact of life. Maybe some of us can live a healthy life, but most of us are going to be sick at some point. But what Siddhartha realizes is, okay, well, maybe I'll never get sick. But when he sees this elderly person, he realizes, you know what? We're all going to get old. We're all going to go through this period of our life where we're not going to be able to move as much, to see as much, to hear as much, and people are going to start to look at us the way we look at elderly people, people that need help, right? And he was like, there's no avoiding this. Now, there is one way to avoid getting old, but it's not a good way, which leads us to the third person Siddhartha ends up encountering. As he continues his journey down the road, he now encounters a dead man, right? So just to review, he first meets a sick man, then an elderly man, and at this point he meets a dead man, right? Now, this is a dead body on the road. So you can imagine that's already pretty crazy thing to see. I don't know how many of you guys have actually ever seen a dead body before, maybe at a funeral with an open casket or something. I've actually seen a dead body in my life. My grandfather was a coroner, which is a person that has to, like, legally testify that a person is dead. And one time when I was around your age, I was 13 years old, he asked me and my brother if we wanted to go with him. Since he was a district judge, it was his job to legally pronounce people dead. And I remember seeing this dead body on the side of the road. It had 3 bullets. The guy had 3 bullets in his chest. And it was something that I will always remember. It stays with you to see a dead body, right? And obviously this guy had been murdered with a gun, right? But I don't know what the state of the man that Siddhartha sees, but I'm imagining that it was something like that. He sees this dead body, and this is ultimately something that he definitely has never experienced. Siddhartha never knew anybody who had died before, right? His parents were still alive, and he didn't even know elderly people. But what really hits Siddhartha here is that he might not get sick, but there's a chance he will. He will definitely get old. But what he realizes is, one thing that is definitely going to happen to him is he's going to die, just like this man on the road. And everybody's going to die. And at this point, you can imagine Siddhartha, this sheltered guy who never left his palace before, is realizing that, damn, life can be really, really tough. We might get sick, we might get a disability, or we might get old and lose our senses. Like, some of you guys might even know people with dementia. That's a very difficult thing to deal with. But one thing we're definitely all going to have to go through is death. And at this point, Siddhartha is very, very broken up about this. He's very emo, let's say that. He continues walking, and then finally he meets the fourth person. And the person he meets is a monk. Now, if you don't know what a monk is, it's basically a very religious person. A monk can be from any religion, but at this time period in India, the monk was Hindu, and Hindu monks were known for meditating for days at a time. And he encounters this monk and he sees him meditating on the side of the road. And Siddhartha asks him what he's doing. And the monk says he's meditating. And Siddhartha says, why? And the monk just invites him to meditate with him. And Siddhartha sits down and he begins meditating. It's during that meditation that Siddhartha makes up his mind that he will never return to the palace. And he never does. And he actually spends the next 40 years of his life living life as a monk. He wanders the countryside and he goes through all sorts of stuff, right? The belief back then was that if you want to discover the meaning of life, because this is where Siddhartha was, like, what is the meaning of life? If there's all this pain and suffering, why do we live? So the idea is that you have to strip yourself away from all of these distractions, right? Like, oh, I'm gonna play my Xbox, or I'm gonna go on my smartphone, or I'm gonna do this or that, I'm gonna watch the game. All of these are distractions, and if you can get all those distractions away from you, then you will live a true life. So what he does is he leaves everything behind. He leaves behind his wife, his palace. He goes homeless, and all he does is wander in rags. And sometimes they even deprive themselves from eating so that they can see what life is really about. They're trying to discover the meaning of life. And after 40 years of wandering across the Indian country, eventually Siddhartha sits down under a fig tree and meditates for 7 straight days. And on that seventh day, he suddenly has a moment of enlightenment. And he reaches what is called nirvana. Notice that nirvana is underlined. It is a vocabulary word. This will be on your quiz and your tests. So what nirvana basically means is enlightenment. And what that means is basically you live life in the dark, right? Imagine if you had to get from one place to another and it's dark, you can't see where you're going. You're going to bump into things. You might fall down. You're lost, basically. But when you become enlightened, the word light is in there. It's like someone turns on the light. Once someone turns on the light, now you can see where you're going and you can get to where you want to be. So when you reach nirvana, it's like in your life, you're lost, but then they turn on the light and now you can see life for what it really is. So basically, by reaching nirvana, Siddhartha discovers the meaning of life. What is the point of everything? And when you reach nirvana, then you become known as a Buddha. So what Siddhartha Gautama was the very first Buddha, right? So a lot of people think that Buddhists worship the Buddha. It's not true. Basically, what Buddhism is people who are trying to become a Buddha. Siddhartha Gautama is the first person that actually accomplishes this. And for the rest of his life, he's going to start teaching other people how they can reach nirvana and how they can become a Buddha as well. Because there's actually going to be more than one Buddha in the history of this religion, right? But he was the first one. So hopefully you guys all copy this down. And now we can go on to our next slide, right? So in order for Siddhartha to teach people how they can reach nirvana and how they can become Buddhas themselves, he has to first convince them about the 3 universal truths. And you guys are going to have to know this, so pay attention. They're called universal truths because they're going to be true whether it's 100 years ago, today, 100 years from now, whether you're in the United States, China, Antarctica, Mars, it doesn't matter. These things are true no matter what. That's what makes them universal. And before you can even hope to reach nirvana and understand the meaning of life, you have to understand these 3 universal truths. Number 1 is that nothing lasts forever. I'm sure you guys have all heard that before, but it took Siddhartha 40 years of meditating and fasting and all these things to realize that this is the truth, that nothing lasts forever. It doesn't matter what it is. We all kind of know that, but we don't ever want to admit it, right? And this is going to be a little depressing, guys. I'm just going to throw it out there, but it's going to pick up later, but it is depressing at first, right? Nothing lasts forever, right? We know that our life will one day end, right? This planet will one day stop being a planet, right? Like you guys all know the sun eventually will become a red giant and it'll engulf, and even the sun itself will one day stop existing. Our relationships will all end. This class will end. This lecture will end. Nothing will last forever. And that can sound kind of depressing. But at the same way, it also can be very positive, right? Because, for example, this pandemic that we're living through will also one day end, right? If you're going through a hard time in your life, if you're going through a lot of pain in your life, well, one day that will end also. So it's like two sides of the same coin. Nothing lasts forever can be bad, right? When you think of, one day you're going to lose your family members, you're going to lose your pet, your kitty, your puppy, right? But also it could be a good thing, because if you're going through a hard time, if something bad is happening in the world, you can tell yourself, well, that's also going to end one day. And that's a universal truth. According to Buddhism, that's one of the first things you have to accept, that nothing will last forever. The second universal truth is that people and possessions, right, material things, will never make you happy. And that's another one that's tough for people to want to admit, right? If your happiness comes from your relationships with people, well, guess what? They're going to let you down and you will never be happy, right? If your happiness is dependent on, your boyfriend, that's my boo. My boo is going to make me happy. Well, guess what? According to Buddhism, no, he's not. One day that relationship will end, or your boyfriend will mess up, right? And not Mr. Lee, no, no, no. My mom is what makes me happy, and my mom will always be there for me. Okay, but is she really? Your mom might be a saint of a woman, but again, nothing lasts forever. So one day your mom will be gone. And if you depended on your mother to be happy, what's going to happen to you when she's gone, right? Or, Mr. Lee, all I need in my life is my smartphone and my PS4, and I'm good to go, Mr. Lee. That's it. Well, not really, right? The possessions you have might make you happy for a moment. Like, you were probably very happy when you got that PS4, but how happy are you going to be next year when the PS5 comes out? You're still going to be happy with that PS4, right? So the second universal truth is that you can't make your happiness come from people and possessions. That'll never work. And the third universal truth is kind of more philosophical, more spiritual, but it's very important for Buddhism, which is that everything changes, right? And so we kind of know that, right? The seasons, right? Spring, fall, winter, summer, and people change, right? You start off as a baby, and then a toddler, and then a child, then a teenager, then an adult, right? We know that everything changes, but really this is important speaking about the soul. So here's something that's very important to understand about Buddhism and Hinduism, because remember, Siddhartha was Hindu, that is very different from Christianity and Islam, which is that they don't believe that the soul is eternal. Right. So if you're Christian or Muslim or Jewish, you believe like, hey, here is Tommy, and Tommy is going to be Tommy for his whole life. He's going to grow up. He's going to have a big, happy family. He's going to get really old. And one day he's going to pass away in his sleep. He lived a wonderful life, and he's going to go to heaven. And in heaven, he is going to be Tommy still, right? His soul will always be Tommy. Well, that's not the case in Hinduism and Buddhism. They do not believe that the soul is eternal. They believe that the soul gets reincarnated. So some of you guys may have heard that word before, reincarnation, but that's what they believe. So Tommy, is Tommy right now, and he's going to grow up and he's going to get old and he's going to have a great life. And then when he dies, his soul is going to get reincarnated, meaning it's going to come back in another life as another living thing. Tommy might come back as another person. He might come back as a golden retriever. He might come back as a flower, right? Those are all living things. And every living thing has a soul, according to Buddhism. But let's say Tommy comes back as a girl from China. He's a Chinese girl named, I don't know. Think of a Chinese name. I can't think of one right now, right? But as a Chinese girl, she's not going to remember her previous life as Tommy, the doctor from Bloomfield, right? So that's the problem in Buddhism. Your soul gets recycled, basically, gets reincarnated, and you're not going to remember your previous life, right? So that's an important thing to note. I don't want to get too deep into it, but that is the third universal truth. Okay, once you understand all three universal truths, nothing lasts forever. People and possessions will not make you happy. Everything changes. There is no eternal soul. It's pretty depressing. right? But now you're ready to discover how you can reach nirvana. And the way you reach nirvana is what Siddhartha Gautama called the Four Noble Truths. And you have to understand there's three universal truths, but now here are the Four Noble Truths. These are the ones, the three universal truths are kind of like, okay, before you can even walk into the room, you got to know these three things. Do you accept these three things? You're like, okay, now that you're in the room, now we can teach you. And they teach you the Four Noble Truths. The first noble truths the first noble truth is that all living things suffer. Okay. So that's hard for people to get. Again, it sounds a little depressing, but it's important that everything that is alive suffers. That is the noble truth. That's what he realized when he saw the sick man, the old man, the dead man. We all suffer. And it's not just people, right? It's animals, it's plants. They're alive, therefore they suffer. I'll always remember one day when I was watching, I think, some sort of documentary or something, and like, you guys ever smelled like that fresh cut grass smell, like somebody's mowing the lawn, and you could smell it in the air. And then one day I learned that that smell is actually the grass having releasing a chemical, and that chemical that they release, which is the smell that we pick up on, the fresh cut grass smell, it's actually the grass crying out for help because it's being cut in half, right? The grass actually communicating to all of the other plants out there that it needs help because it's being cut, right? And that's crazy when you think about it, that plants and animals go through all these pain and suffering the same way as people do. So basically, the idea is that if you are alive, you will suffer. There's no way out of it. All living things suffer. That's the first noble truth. And it can be depressing, but when you think about it, I mean, I look at you guys like you're 12 and 13 years old. What do you know about suffering? But I'm sure you at home thinking, I'm sure you've suffered, right? Everybody suffers, right? So that's the first noble truth. The second noble truth is this is the big one. The cause of all suffering is desire. So this is probably the one that took the Buddha the longest to figure out. Why do we suffer? Right? Why was the sick man suffering? Why was the elderly man suffering? It's because they desired something. Well, what would a sick person desire? Why are they suffering? Well, probably because the sick man desires not to be sick. If you desire not to be in pain, or if you desire something, it causes you to suffer. Think about it. Is there anything that you desire today? Is there any way that that desire that you have is also the cause of you suffering? Right? Maybe you went to school one day and your best friend from last year didn't say hi to you, just walked right past you and ignored you. And that made you sad. And now you're all depressed and you're going home and you're like, what's happened? And you're suffering at home. Well, why are you suffering? Because your friend didn't say hi to you. So what? Well, you wanted that person to say hi to you because you want to be friends with them. So basically, the cause of your suffering was that you desired your friend to say hi. Let me give you a good example. Um, One day, I really, really wanted a new iPhone. I asked my mom, can I please get the iPhone? And my mom said, sure, just get your grades up. And I said, okay, sure. So then the market period ended. My grades went up, and I told my mom, hey, mom, can I get that iPhone? And my mom said, maybe, I'm a little short on cash, but maybe. And I snapped. I was like, what do you mean? You told me I'd get that new iPhone if my grades went up. And I started arguing with her, and she got mad at me, and then she threw something. And then I went upstairs and I slammed the door shut. Then my dad came up, like, how dare I slam the door on my mother? And then my dad punishes me, and now I can't go out on the weekend to watch the movie with my friends. I'm stuck in my room and I'm mad. I hate my mom. I hate my dad. I hate the world. Why did this all begin? What did I desire? I desired that new iPhone. If I hadn't desired that iPhone, none of this would have happened, right? I'll give you another example. I have a big crush on a girl, and I write a note and I tell her how I feel, and I give it to her that day. She reads it and she writes me a note back. And in the note, she says, ew, no. Damn. Obviously, that's never happened to me, but I'm just saying. Now I go home, I'm emo. My mom asks me what's wrong, and I tell her nothing, and my heart is broken. The girl I have this huge crush on just shot me down badly. Why am I suffering? Because I desired that girl. So the idea is that everything that makes us suffer is because it starts off with a desire. Well, wait, Mr. Lee. What if you're sad because your grandfather died? Now, actually, I could speak about this. Both my grandmother and my grandfather died within 1 year from each other just recently. And certainly, what do you desire? Well, when you think about it, the reason why people are so sad at a funeral is because they're definitely desiring something. What are they desiring? They're desiring that person to not be dead, right? So when you think about it, every time we are suffering, it actually has a root in having a desire. And this is a problem because we all desire something, right? So the first noble truth is that all living things suffer. It doesn't matter what it is. It could be a kitten, it could be a grass, it could be a person. Second noble truth is the cause of that suffering is desire. Now, we've gone down a dark path at this point, right? But here's where it gets better. The third noble truth is that that there is a cure to that suffering. So we're not actually just destined to suffer and life sucks. That's the third noble truth. There's a way to actually stop suffering. And that's the big one. That's the whole point of Buddhism, is how can we make ourselves stop suffering? Well, obviously it's to stop desiring, but how can we stop desiring things, right? That's the whole idea behind Buddhism. And the way to stop desiring things is the fourth noble truth, which is to follow what is called the middle way. Well, what is the middle way? It's also called the Eightfold Path. And that's what our last slide is about. We're almost done here, guys. So the middle way is known as the Eightfold Path, right? So the middle way means that you have to live a life that is not full of indulgence and luxury, but is also not full of hardships and sacrifice. So if you don't know, indulgence and luxury means you can't live a life where you just do whatever you want and you just want all the pleasures in life and you want to just have all the fancy things. And think about it. Siddhartha knows about this because for the first 20 some years of his life, he lived in a palace. He had whatever he wanted. He could have anything to eat. He could have anything to drink. He could have anything to play with. He could have had any girl he wanted. Everything was there for him, right? He never had to lift a finger. And he realized that is not the way to live your life. And then after, when he wandered around for 40 years, he had nothing. He was starving himself. He was homeless. He had no shoes. He was in rags. He didn't have a home, right? He had a very difficult life. And he discovered, this is dumb too. This doesn't work. So what works is the middle way. And in order to guide you to live a life in the middle way, he created what is called the Eightfold Path. And in order to follow the Eightfold Path, you have to do these 8 things. You have to have the right, all of these that you see on the screen, right? You have to have the right action, the right value, the right effort, right? So I'm not going to get into every single one of these, but in Buddhism, they teach you how to do everything the right way, right? So for example, the right actions means you got to do the right things. Your actions have to be correct. You can't be doing what is wrong. If you wanted to have the right work, that means your job has to be a good job. You can't have a job that's going to force you to do bad things, right? If you want to have the right effort, all these things, the right meditation, the right mindset, all these different things, you got to do them all the right way. And I'll get more into the Eightfold Path later, but for the sake of not making this a super long video, I'm not going to go over each one of these, but you got all 8 of these you are responsible for knowing. I know there's a lot. There's the 3 universal truths, the 4 noble truths, and now the Eightfold Paths, having the right everything. You gotta, now you're not expected to have this, right? It took the Buddha 40 years to figure this out. And some people believe that it took him several lifetimes. Because remember, they believe in reincarnation and they believe that you don't reach nirvana in one lifetime. It's going to take you several lifetimes to get to this point. But if you can do the right everything that's listed here, then maybe you can become the next Buddha and reach enlightenment. Right? So I know that's kind of a lot, but here's what I want you guys to do. For this lesson, now you've watched the video, you now watch this video with the notes, you copied everything down. For your assignment, I want you to create a storybook, right? So what I mean here is like a kid's book, right? So I want to have pictures and just basic little bubbles of words and dialogue is what I'm looking for, right? And I want you to use Google Slides to create a little storybook, like if you were writing a book to some kindergartners about Siddhartha Gautama's journey, right? So basically, when he leaves the palace and the four people that he sees, and then how that leads him to reach nirvana. So your story is going to begin with him leaving the palace and is going to end with him reaching nirvana underneath the fig tree. And you're going to have the sick man, the old man, the dead man, and the monk in the story. I'm going to also attach a sample of this storybook that a student from, I think it was last year, who turned this in. And it's a pretty decent example. All you do is use Google Slides. I encourage you to put in some pictures, put in some word bubbles of like what Siddhartha is saying and what's going on, and just telling the story of how Siddhartha went from being a Hindu prince to being a wandering monk to becoming the Buddha, right? So you're going to do that on Google Slides. You're going to have 2 days to do this. And then you're just going to turn this in. Okay. So hopefully this wasn't too boring for you and it was okay. You got to copy all your notes, and I'll see you guys on Friday to do a live chat, or you could always write me comments on Classroom. All right. Till then, thanks for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.